Welcome everyone from all over the world and especially from America to this new chapter of L'École Online Conversation. We are here in Hong Kong in early morning with Laure and myself, and we are on the Hong Kong campus, and in November we are actually celebrating our 3 years anniversary. Before we go into this conversation dedicated to the history of ring, we actually want to do some housekeeping details for you. First, languages. Laure, my dear?
Yes, so today the talk is conducted in English, and if you wish to listen to it in French, we will actually deliver it in French on Tuesday, the 22nd of November, next week. At the end of the conversation, we will take your questions. Feel free to ask them throughout the conversation. Our moderator in Hong Kong, Alice, will relay them to us.
Yes, so our discussion will actually take between 45 to 50 minutes. And by the end, we're going to have this Q&A session with some of your best questions sampled by Alice. But otherwise, again, we will try to answer them along the way. We might not be able to answer your questions, but we will do our best. And eventually, we can also follow up later with you. So now let's start into our discussion today, which is basically a history of the ring. So I'm going to, starting the first slide of the PowerPoint. And there are many things that should be said before we really go further into details. First of all, if we wanted to do something chronologic about the evolution of rings through times, we will be together for maybe a day, 2 days, a week, or years. Experts actually are still debating, working on those little objects, what they meant, how they've been meant for, the commissioners. So a lot of questions remained. So what is also important as the question is the word ring. Ring, etymologically, there are still debates about where such a word comes from. What we know is ring in German, in the Dutch, or in the Anglo-Saxon kind of backgrounds. Rings have been appearing quite recently, let's say 1,000 years ago, but not that long. And before that, we don't really know what are the roots for such a word, but it's tied on to chain, cycle, circle, the ring, the loop. But really, I cannot give you one single answer because one finds different definitions about that. The second thing is, such a small word and a small jewelry piece, the ring that you put on your finger, is actually quite complicated. And it's not just a kind of fashion statements. It's much more than this. If we travel back in time, that little word, a ring, is actually tied on to a kind of a hoop that you're going to have around your finger in metal. And then eventually it evolves. You will have then a bezel and shoulders that will complement and adorn the ring to deliver many more messages. So rings are communication tools. If you look on this slide, all the objects there are rings, but they look so different from one another. With the Frank Stella piece, we have a 3-dimensional sculpture that should actually cover some of the hand. The hoop is actually at the left, at the bottom. So it is sculptural, it is all in gold, there's the polished mirror effect. But on the other side, on the right-hand side, those are also rings with effigies, deities, protective figures. So this is something interesting to take into consideration. Then you would also see that the gem material and the metal do not necessarily belong together. Rings are sized over time. Sometimes rings get created. So really the metal part and the gem or the adornment on the bezel do not belong to the same era. The second thing we wanted to talk about with actually rings is it's one of the jewels that can be seen both by the wearer, because we can look at her hands, and also by the audience, the public, people nearby. So it's a very important communication tool. Even so, or even more, rings would also bear a kind of ethical or moral dimension. If I go out for dinner or if I go party and I take away my wedding ring, I am getting naughty. I don't behave morally. So there are a lot of things connected to wearing the rings or not wearing it on the pinky, wearing it on the index, wearing it on the thumb. It has different meanings. It's hiding or it's revealing some of our personality and some of the social life we actually carry. So here we have two examples of big legendary rings. One is with, of course, Platoon and the Geiger's ring, which is a ring that should be, when it's worn, should make the wearer invisible. And Platoon's question is, would you behave the same way if you are invisible in your city? Would you be just? Would you abide or be compliant and abide by the law? Or would you actually steal and maybe do things that are forbidden? And same with the Lord of the Rings, we know better. Frollo, the little hobbit, could actually fall into temptation by wearing the ring. So, and then you also have the inscriptions on the ring that might convey power or meaning to it. So this is to brush you kind of the landscape before we really go further. Then another point we want to tell, we don't have time to discuss all the different details, and there is something we need to take into considerations, which is hand adornments in general. Hands are always adorned, painted, and there is something we wanted to touch upon with Laure concerning Imperial China and some hand ornaments or nail ornaments. Can you please get into this, my dear Laure?
Sure, Mathilde. So actually, in Imperial China, there is a long history of ornating fingers and nails especially. What we're looking at here is really a fashion that originated in the Ming Dynasty, which is a Han dynasty in terms of ethnicity, and then it was widespread in the Qing Dynasty because they wanted to associate themselves with the preceding dynasty. In this case, we're looking at fingernail guard, and the idea is really that the nobility can actually grow their nail because they don't have to work and they have servants around them. So the fact that they can grow the nail is really a status symbol in itself. It's really saying that they're part of this social class that is the nobility. This is a fashion that is mostly with women, but also with men. The fashion of wearing the fingernail guard, just like the object we're looking at on the screen at the moment, this beautiful gold and kingfisher feather ornate fingernail guard is actually very delicate work. And it's really worn, as we can see in the portrait of the Empress Sisi in a minute, it's really worn on 2 fingers. Usually they're worn in pairs, which is quite important. And they can be worn on one hand or 2 hands or either the left or the right. But usually it's on the pinky and the finger next to it. What it's really saying is it's an immediately recognizable symbol, and that's why in this beautiful painting that is an official portrait of the Empress Sisi, we can really see it on her hand. This is very interesting because it was done by a Western artist that was in the courts at the request of the Empress herself, and she chose, of course, to be represented with this ornament. In the case of the painting, we're looking at something that is made of jade. So they're always made of precious material. It's very important. And they, most of the time, have a lot of symbols, such as maybe like phoenixes for the empress, maybe like different bats, whatnot, all sorts of symbols that are decorating these fingernail guards. It's a long tradition in the sense of they were actually ornating or painting the nails before with lacquer, in very ancient China. However, over time, it started using important material, rich materials,
lasting material, right?
Pretty much.
It's durable.
Yes, so gold and silver, and really this starts in the Zhou dynasty. In the Ming dynasty, we start having an importance of colors, and slowly we have this fashion of the fingernail guard. We have it also in the Ottoman Empire, but you know, like that could be another topic of conversation.
So food for thought, and of course there could be phalange rings, there could be gloves, there could be a lot of the henna painting as well, but this is something we don't have time to touch upon. Let's go on into rings more specifically. So we are going to journey into 3 different chapters. First, again, we go thematically and not chronologically, and we are going to go into the function. Actually, rings could really be functional. They protect, or they convey, or they are really used for certain things, and we're going to see that in a minute. Then we singled out a few emblems or symbols for us to discuss. And then we're going to look at art and how rings could be miniature art history pieces.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the functions into rings, and let's travel back. Laure, being an archaeologist and an art historian, we travel back to antiquity. And what about rings in antiquity? They are extremely useful, right? What are they?
Indeed. So what we're looking at the moment is on the left-hand side, you have an ancient Roman ring, which dates back to antiquity. What is interesting, of course, is the inscription that says Pulchris, but that ring has a highly functional practical use, really. It's actually a key ring. So when you think about the fashion at the time, the Romans were wearing togas, so they don't have pockets. So there is nowhere to put the key. It could be on a chain, but this is really a key ring. So in this case, it's worn as a ring on the end, and the way it's used, it may have been used as taking it off and using it as unlocking something, or it can be possibly just used like this. However, it's really meant to open a chest, for instance. That could be like a chest with treasures in it. It could be collections of things, could be other valuables. But the point here is that the ring really has a practical use, which is to be a key. We have other examples. For instance, yes, the signet ring in the middle, which dates back to the medieval times. In this case, we're really close to actually seals. So this is used as a way of signing documents or really being conveying the identity of the bearer. So again, it's a very practical use. This one is from Géant de Grailly, so it's also a lot of heraldry coming with it, and it's recognizable as belonging to this family. What is fascinating is when, of course, the wearer keeps the ring, but the sign that goes with it, the seal, actually can travel through different countries and maybe time as well. So it's really interesting to see the very practical uses. And of course, on the right-hand side, we have more modern example that are in the Yves Gastou collection, which is part of the exhibition that we have currently at l'École in Hong Kong. And there's a beautiful catalog, and it's quite fascinating to see that there was a lot of reinterpretation through time.
So here, again, so those rings, they are identity. They are kind of like a passport in a way, or like your identity card. And the way it's actually traveling, it's, of course, you press it and you print it on wax or actually on clay, and that is that printed material that would actually seal the documents. But now, so this is signature, this is pedigree, this is heirloom, this is family, this is practical things. But we also wanted to go into the kind of bond, the kind of agreement it also symbolizes between, because lots of rings are actually duplicated and would be worn by two different parts. How does it all started?
So actually, when we are thinking about rings, we're usually thinking about marital bond first. In the case of the ring we're looking at on the left-hand side, which is again a late Roman antiquity ring, we have a motif that is the goddess of harmony, homonoia, which means oneness of mind. And really, the concept here is that it's ancient Greece, and as Greece is colonizing different regions around its own borders, it's actually looking at whether the people in these different parts of the region can acclimate and believe acculture to the Greek mindset. And if they can, then it's homonoia, and they're under the same cultural realm. So it's really explaining that two foreign things can actually come together and have the same philosophy, for instance, or the same goal, which is essential to a marital bond, of course. So in this case, that's what the ring is portraying. It's the goddess of harmony, homonoia.
So it travels through Greece and through Rome, but eventually
Absolutely.
it would translate into wedding symbols and then slowly disappear. But the ring stays, right?
The ring does stay, and slowly we're becoming like more interested in actually inscription. So first you had this goddess motif, and over time you start having inscription. And even instead of being like for the public, really to be shown like the goddess on the left-hand side, on the outside of the ring, we start having inscription on the inside of the ring. And so the meaning is really inside the ring. The ring we're looking at here, which is actually a Renaissance revival, as the colors that are normally associated with love, which is the gemstone that is red and then the white of the diamonds. And of course, it's the gold. The different decoration on it, the different designs are actually coming from different fashion and times. However, what we really want to show you here is the inscription inside the ring that now conveys the message in a much more private and intimate way.
Yeah,
but
so
the function remains.
The color are basically substituting to or substitutes to the deity itself, but it is about harmony and a contract and the way that people agreed on both sides. So this is the marital bond ring. What is also interesting is we have been with Venus, but let's go with March. What is it, or with Mars? What is interesting is a lot of rings could also, well, they are not just marital or feminine objects, they're actually quite masculine, and they could be weapons. So here we have 3 examples, and the first on the left is more like a passive violence. That ring, which is a Doge ring revival from the Venetian times, could actually be opened. You have a little clasp and you can open the ring. It's rather a kind of big piece, and it would have been worn on the gloves by the Doge, and it's quite similar to the episcopal rings in certain ways. It's quite big to really recognize the leader. But because there is a compartment that is hidden there, it's menacing as well, because what does it actually encapsulate? We don't really know. What is inside? We don't know, but some historians would say it could be a vial of poison, it could be some seals that could sentence someone to death or prison. Well, you see, it's mystery. What we don't see is always mysterious. So this is a kind of a passive violence. Of course, on the 2 other sides, on the right-hand side, you can see a very beautiful crystal-like brass knuckle and a knuckle ring as well with the dragon. So here we are going back to ancient Rome again, to actually the gladiators, and to this fighting kind of either boxing or warfare kind of apparel. Of course, when you're fighting, you want to protect your hands. If you know Thai boxing or boxing nowadays, they always basically use leather or linen to wrap up the knuckles. So it's actually intensifying the punch when you actually fight, and it's also protecting, of course, the bones. And eventually, this rebellious or quite warlike, very masculine object can also be transformed by jeweler into something more ornamental, as such the ones we've got here with the dragons, with the pose, as you can see here. So this is, of course, it's too fragile and precious to be used actually to knock people and to fight. But this is an interesting connection that we wanted to stress, even though nowadays having a brass knuckle or a coup de poing américain is actually quite forbidden. So it's seen as very the border between a weapon and an ornament. So this is an interesting factor. And the same thing could be seen in ancient China on a very specific device, which is basically the archer's ring. So this is where Laure is going to make us travel to archery in ancient China. So here a specific example we wanted to discuss.
So indeed, that tradition is actually not only in China. We can see it as well in the Mughal Empire, for instance. So we see the 2 slides here. We have 2 examples, and they are beautiful examples. So the archery ring is really something that is highly practical to start with. The art of archery is the bow and string. Now, when you're pulling the string with your thumb, of course, it could be like it's bent to a certain strength.
Yeah.
It could be very hurtful, actually. So this is to protect your thumb really from the string hurting you. And you can see that the materials here are jade. There are beautiful decoration on them. You can see the Qilong dragon, notably, on the Chinese example. You can also see the deer. So there is really this relationship with the hunt. And this is the Manchu art of archery. The Manchus are very skilled with it. And it's a tradition that is also sometimes going into warfare because, of course, it can be quite deadly, the bow and arrow. But these rings could be ornamental as well, and it's really beautiful ornaments that are also status symbols in themselves. They really say something about the wearer and the fact that he's a very strong either hunter or maybe like warrior. Again, here, yes, you have the details of the Qilong dragon, for instance. So all these beautiful symbols are also conveying that maybe you can appropriate yourself the strength of the animal or of the mythological creature. So it's really something that is very prevalent in ancient culture and notably in the Manchu art of archery.
So here we have something that could be granted as a reward, of course, to a general or to a very valorous warrior, and it's bearing the predation kind of values, like you take away the strength from the animal itself. You are actually wearing the effigy of. But what is interesting is, well, in a way, the continuity of warfare might eventually be casualties and then mourning. And so there is a tradition we tend to forget nowadays, because I think nowadays we have pictures and access to image. When someone passes, we actually are used to have that person's portrait or pictures. And when you attend funerals, you would have a leaflet given to you incorporating the person's image. But in ancient times, when someone would actually pass, you would, or in a way, commission as a family member or as an admirer, you would commission rings bearing the very effigy of that person, such as the Duke of Burgundy on the left-hand side. So that would really be a commemorative piece showing your respect, your allegiance, maybe your family bonds as well. Eventually, with time, the effigy could be one thing, but you could also commission initials with human hair or with different kind of symbols. In the very middle piece, we see a commemorative piece with actually M and A, which is actually standing for Marie Antoinette. So, and there is woven hair at the back. So, of course, that could be a commemorative piece. That could also be something worn by a Habsburg family member after the French queen got actually beheaded. So we have a whole of this tradition. And finally, on the right-hand side, you have something more standard. So basically, when the funeral would actually take place and the church service would take place, by the end of the service, you would actually, as a family member, chip out or give out some rings to the attendees as a kind of souvenir or kind of family token. So people could wear it on their skin, really to worship the image of the person who passed. And those little rings would be basically coming from the jeweler's portfolio. You could choose a black enamel, urn, a date, a lady, usually kind of a Pietà lady crying by the urn as we have here. And all that would really be something completely, I would say, fashionable to give and traditional to give, especially during the 18th century. So this is really devotion rings, and of course we don't have time to touch upon that today, but there are also all the Christian rings people would wear for prayer, for rosary. We can go into that chapter. It would be actually another conversation. Now, coming from those rings that are rather practical and really have a certain moment where and when to be worn and given, now we go into the symbols and emblems with Laure. And here again, we had to make a selection because there are endless symbols. So I'm going to continue with the thread of mourning to go into the image of death with something that is kind of also present nowadays, but through different aspects, which is the skull and the memento mori. So memento mori means remember you will die. Eventually, in a way, when we're going to be buried or when people pass, the only human remains that would really last for a long time would be the skull. So the skull is tied on to this idea about remember of death, remember your Christian duties, don't be too vain in the word of vanitas, because we all end up the same way, and this is the destiny. So the very ring on the left-hand side is showing us a Bible adorned with beautiful precious gemstones, amazing enamel work, and also this skull at the very top of the lid. And you can open actually the Bible, and sometimes you would find another skull within. So this would be something, again, you wear all the time as something to remind, it's between religion and also protection in a way, to remind you to be a Christian. But on the other side, it also reminds you to be happy, to have a carpe diem, to actually enjoy the day. You live your life to the fullest. And with time and evolution in 19th century, 20th century, nowadays, the skull is much more a rock and roll device. So it goes from something tied on to death, just like in the middle kind of pieces. Those rings are bearing human hair, so that would be another practice. You would take like a friendship bracelet or like a very kind of a personal token. You would take hair to really make a material for a ring. But eventually, the skull nowadays became something quite connected to youth, connected to provocation, connected to rock and roll, stage person, the Rolling Stones. We all know about Keith Richards and his hands, and all the rings he's got. So now the skull might be much more about challenging death, going further, going beyond, and just like really challenging yourself and going to your very limits. So this is for the memento mori, which is something quite Christian. And what is so interesting is in this part of the world where we are, Hong Kong, China, Japan, Asia, the skull is super taboo. It's supposed to bring bad luck. So you also see that symbols would actually travel and have very different connections according to where you are. But now let's go about this friendship sign. Let's go about this kind of token of fidelity and trust. There is a certain device that would exist, right?
Indeed. And actually, this device originated also in antiquity in terms of the feathering itself, which is really two hands clasped. It's a very important symbol that is, of course, a symbol of friendship. Here, what we're looking at, the first slide is a clattering, and you can see there are three symbols there. There's, of course, the hands that are the symbol of friendship. There's the heart, which is the symbol of love. And then there is the loyalty that is symbolized by the crown. So when looking at this ring, it says a lot of different things. And of course, it's a very important communication tool, again, as Mathilde mentioned earlier. And actually, a lot of codification comes with it. So for instance, when you're wearing this ring on your left hand, and when the heart is pointing towards you, it means you're married. When it's pointing outward, it means you're engaged. If you're wearing it on your right hand, then it means if the heart is pointing towards you, that you're in a relationship. If it's pointing outwards, it means you're single. So a lot of communication with the people around you, within your society, through just this ring. And again, it originates from this idea of fide, which is loyalty, really fidelity to a bond. But this is a more love-related example. So on the example we're looking at right now, we
it's
still
a
have the
beautiful
hands.
piece,
it's amazing. Right? It's fantastic enamel work, and it also has the beautiful heart, the red heart. Again, we're looking at these two colors that we mentioned earlier. So the heart is red, and then you have the diamonds as well. You have the embodiment of the crown. Actually, here it's actually in the fleur de lis, the design that you have at the wrists of the hands. And then you have the little lock as well. So this is all more about a love bond. And it's really fascinating to see how the clattering that originated in Ireland actually became more of a symbol, but almost throughout like different countries in Europe. And it's really a very interesting ring for that reason.
So here we see like how with the ring you can actually silently speak with the others, and here with rings and crowns you also show your political support, which is quite interesting as well as a kind of a pin for political campaigns nowadays. So how interesting. Now with this feathering, we actually go from the very core of what you might know of, which is the engagement ring. So engagement rings, we at l'École, we actually have a whole class about the topic. What is interesting to say is the engagement ring tradition is recorded in Western history in the Renaissance, let's say 1500 to make it easy. But the rings that we know now are actually quite recent, especially the diamond connection. Let's look at what we have, and can we look deeper into this, Laure?
Yes, so what is interesting to notice is that originally, when we're talking about antiquity, the rings are mostly for men, because women are not such an important part of the
jewelry wearer.
The jewelry wearer and the legal system per se. So in terms of social communication, it's actually very important that men are wearing this kind of not only precious, but also communication
devices,
tools. Exactly. Yeah. So what we're looking at right now is probably what we know the best about engagements today, which is the Tiffany engagement ring. So this was actually created in 1886 by Tiffany, and it's a very iconic piece. You can see the six-prong setting, which is really putting the diamond as the most important piece of this ornament and piece of jewelry. And it's really something that is now almost global. Everybody knows the solitaire is really the incarnation, like really the signal of an engagement. And it comes also with a lot of codes, actually.
A ceremony. There is always a ceremony with the engagement, which is coordinating. There is no engagement if there is no ceremony.
Absolutely. So there is also, like, you know, asking
Rituals.
for someone's hand. There are a lot of rituals coming with it, and hopefully the marriage lasts. But if it doesn't, there's a lot more codification that goes with that ring. In the case of the Cartier Trinity ring, we're looking at a piece that was actually created with the artist Jean Cocteau, a French artist, who's famous for multiple achievements, notably through poetry, visual arts, cinema, many things. And he worked with Louis Cartier to create this really iconic piece. Here we have something that is a trinity. It's looking at also the number 3, which can be not only religious in Europe and beyond through Christianity, but it's also something that relates to the family. So you have the couple and hopefully the offspring of the couple, the children. So that's where this is really hinting at. And you have the 3 different gold here. So you have rose gold, yellow gold, and white gold. It's a really beautiful, iconic piece, and it's a very different way from the solitaire of looking at the engagement. It's quite fascinating to see that these pieces, though, are really the turn of the past century on both sides, because this is 1924. Now, in the terms of modern creations, we can look at the Van Cleef & Arpels' beautiful boucle ring, which is actually really a fusion of different cultures, and it's really East meets West. You have, of course, the beautiful colors that we mentioned earlier, with the ruby and the diamonds. Now, in terms of the shape, we're looking at something that is not only the reckless knot, it's also the infinity knot. It's also looking at the number 8, which is really auspicious today in China, for instance. So again, there is a relationship with numerology, just like with the Trinity ring. But also it's related to tying the knot, because this is also something that is very much inspired by the ribbons of the wedding gown and the fashion in that aspect, but also with the expression of tying the knot, which relates to actually tying the hands of the people that are betrothed to each other.
So here we really see a connection with rings that are now maybe what we wear the most are the marital rings and the engagement rings. And this is an interesting feature we take for granted, but actually it's something rather modern and new. Now, from the engagement ring, we also want to travel to the engagement ring. In a way, is protecting your love, and it's showing you the commitment between one another. I wanted to just stress the amuletic properties of certain rings. You might be aware, since antiquity, there's been encyclopedia books called lapidaries that were books listing up the properties of gemstones and metals. And it was believed that those metals and gems coordinated and really sweltered into each other would actually protect the bearer from, it could be from the plague, it could be from pandemics, it could be from accidents and all sorts of disease. So it's an interesting connection. We call it also, especially for the ring that is on the left-hand side here, we really see what one calls apotropaic powers, meaning you believe a ring and certain gems would actually keep the evil at bay or even be like poison defenders. So it's like anti-poisonous. It's gonna heal or protect you from any harm. So here on this very ring, we have a lot of inscriptions as well, as you can see on the hoop, that are engraved in Latin, and all are those magical formulas. So you would keep the again the kind of disease or the bad kind of fatum or the bad destiny away. And then the gemstone is opal here. But it's also connected to the taught stones. So it's really much about stones or gems that are a bit opalescent, whitish, creamy, and it was believed it would also keep certain bad kind of omens away. So this protection, this amulet, is really so important that in Roman times, for instance, lots of men would actually bath in the public bath, and there are some of their rings that they would not dare taking away, such as the ring with the Medusa. The Medusa was supposed to protect you from any harmful kind of what we would call nowadays with viruses, and so they would not depart or not take it off. And in a way, that connection of the apotropaic kind of notion goes with the snake, because what is interesting is on the right hand side we see a much more modern boucheron serpentine ring, but the snake Before and after Christianity, that animal doesn't bear the same kind of properties. It's very auspicious in antiquity, it's very auspicious in China, and it gets quite negative with, of course, the Bible. But originally, snakes are basically annunciators of rain. They are also extremely fierce and defensive animals, such as the cobra, as you might know. But also their venom is poisonous, but it also could be as an anti-poison device if it's prescribed in the proper proportions. So it's as if the animal has death and the cure of death within itself. So the shape, the ring formed by the snake is actually like a never-ending cycle of death and life and rebirth, especially also snakes having to shred their skins in different seasons, so they also symbolize rebirth. So it's a very positive aspect, and then it got faded away with Christianity. But you see the snake, when you have a snake in jewelry, it's always connecting us to antiquity. And if we go for the snake especially, snakes that become gigantic, it's actually a dragon, right? So, and then we go into blessings in ancient China. So here, Laure, we have two different rings. Can we go into deeper?
Yeah, so it's fascinating to see that symbols such as the snake have evolved in ancient and modern times. There are different lectures, different ways of looking at it. And it's the same with the dragon. It's different cultures have different vision of it. So it could be geography or time. In this case, dragon is highly auspicious in China. It's actually related to the court level and to the emperor itself. So in the case of the piece we're looking at right now, it's an ornamental archer ring. And it's a beautiful ring. It's quite heavy. It's also a thumb ring, but it's not really for practical purposes. It's more a status piece. We're looking at a dragon, and it's also taking from the aesthetics of ancient China for the look of it, the way the motif is designed. However, we cannot really see the number of claws, but there is a lot of codification with the number of claws of dragon in ancient China and throughout dynasties all the way to the Qing dynasty because of the imperial connection. So if you have 5 claws, for instance, this is really the imperial level. If you have 3 claws, you're looking at the court level, but not the emperor level. Dragons are normally associated with male, actually, and then phoenixes would be associated with female. So the case of this ring is most likely for men. And again, it's an ornament and a status symbol. When we're looking at the ring on the right-hand side, we're looking at a ring that was most likely for women because it's related to fertility. So again, here we have Trinity, we have the trilogy in the sense of the 3 lotus pods. The lotus is associated with fertility, with giving birth, with having children, bearing children, and it's a very important part of Chinese culture, especially through marriage. So really, you're supposed to have an offspring, ideally a son, back in those dynasties, and it's really very important to see that it's crucial to bear these symbols that will bring these blessings to you. So both are very iconic in very different ways and for different gender.
So of course, if we talk about blessings around the world and in China, we could have another discussion because, and we will come back to that point very soon for the next conversation that will happen in Paris. What is interesting now is we want to go into another round, which is the one of 3-dimensional creations, either quite big or even extremely small. So this is where we're going to go for rings as sculptural art pieces. And here we go into, let's say, the 20th century with 2 interesting pieces that are monumental in terms of tied on to architecture.
Absolutely. So it's really very interesting to see that in terms of the jewelry making, we've really evolved from people that we don't really know the craftsman. We might know the bearer, we know the intention, and we know the social codes. We may not know who the author is, who's the artist behind it. In the 20th century, we're really moving into like creation being named. So now we have artists associated with these different rings, and we have artists creating jewelry. In the case of the 2 pieces we're looking at, the inspiration is coming from architecture. So the Jean Vendôme piece, Jean Vendôme was actually not only trained as a gemologist, which is crucial for jewelry, but he was mostly trained as an artist. And he went to the École Supérieure Nationale des Beaux-Arts, which is the equivalent of an Academy of Fine Art, the highest level in France. So he has both skill, and he's really inspired from the artistic training that he had. And then he's going to go and think outside of the box to create these jewelry pieces. So what we're looking at here is inspired by towering architecture, and it's the tour ring, which is meaning tower. And it's also looking at using these beautiful crystal, this beautiful, not only the beautiful gold, but also these stones we may not be expecting in jewelry. This is actually a very easy to wear piece. It looks really monumental and practical, but it's actually quite comfortable to wear. And of course, it's worthy of museum attention, and the Jean Vendôme pieces have been collected by great museums around the world, but mostly in France. So if you want to see the pieces. Now, the David Ansel piece on the right-hand side, David Ansel is also taking inspiration from architecture, and here, instead of skyscrapers, you might recognize the Duomo, for instance, the dome of the churches. It's interesting to look at the material as well. But David Ansel was also trained, he's coming from a scientific background, being the son of a doctor and being trained in medicine, but he also went to the Brighton College of Arts. So he also has this artistic sensitivity and training, which allows him, again, to think outside of the box and create pieces that have completely different inspiration. Again, looking at materials that may not be the most usual materials for jewelry pieces. Here we're looking at wood, which is really a period of his creative career. And we're looking at completely different aesthetics. And that's really when we start having arts getting into jewelry and the recognition of the makers.
But then the dimensions could also be extremely tiny, and the sculptural aspect could be in a very miniature way, right?
Absolutely. So it's another type of technical feat to actually look at these miniature mechanisms. We're looking at 3 different pieces here, and one of them is actually like a little watch. So what you're looking at on the left-hand side is literally a miniature watch inside of a ring. So can you imagine putting like already the mechanism of a watch inside a watch is already like an achievement, but putting it into a ring and then making it even more appropriate in terms of you're not really looking at the time. So it's another way of looking at the social codes associated with wearing a ring or a watch. But you don't really have to look like you're looking at the time when you're looking at the ring. So you have a beautiful piece here with the enamel chanlevé and the beautiful pearls. But think about how such a tiny piece is actually hiding such a complex mechanism as the mechanism of a watch. Now, looking at the piece in the middle, it's even more astonishing to look at the mechanism of a musical box that is actually hidden inside this ring. And you can tell from the profile here that you're looking at of the ring that it's really not that big. So it's very discreet, and yet it's this absolute technical achievement to put so much into such a miniature piece. This is part of the Yves Gastou collection, and we have another example on the right-hand side, which is actually a spy device. So here, it's an intricate mechanism of a camera with the different variable aperture and the guillotine shutter, and everything has been miniaturized into this ring. So of course it's highly discreet, it's even more discreet than the watch, the first one we were looking at, and it's completely hidden. The use of it allows for secretly taking pictures of whatever documents or people you're actually in the presence of. So it's a KGB device, and this comes with a lot, of course, of stories, and it's interesting in a whole different aspect. But it's fascinating to see what has been achieved in terms of what a ring can actually hold.
So it's really a scientific device that gets miniatured. So in a way, really like a 3-dimensional movement and mechanism that is placed within the ring. So and there is 3 dimensions, even though we cannot see it. But this is the other wonder, actually, that would happen eventually. What is also interesting with rings is that they can transform. So here we see 3 examples of rings that could actually change, or actually was hoops can actually open. So here on the very left-hand side, we see what are called gimel rings. Gimel, like twin rings, it's actually 2 different hoops that can actually open and foil in and foil up, or open and close again. This piece is extremely iconic, actually. And what is interesting is you can see the colors we've been looking at through the discussion with the ruby and the diamond, the red and the white, really for this kind of eternal marriage bond. Here we know it's a marital kind of device because it's engraved with some biblical sentences, such as what God put together cannot be actually separated. Another interesting thing is this piece. It's actually from the Metropolitan Museum, and if you want to see it unfold and if you want to see all the details, I really recommend you go on their website. What is interesting is even on the bezel, the little gemstone could actually open and you would have a skeleton and a baby that would be in gold and enamel, very tiny sculptures that would be integrated within the bezel, within this kind of precious boxes, symbolizing again, there is no beginning and no end, the ring being really a symbol of eternity and of a cycle within human destinies. So that ring is absolutely fascinating. And what is interesting here, this transformation is showcasing craftsmanship at its highest level. It is difficult to make such a device that can open and close so perfectly. And if you think about rings, if you put different rings and hoops actually together, one after the other, it's a chain. So it goes into this kind of, what is the end and beginning of a chain? So it's the same kind of symbol. And we see it especially with the Marshak piece in the center. So that piece is a ring. And if I click, you see it transforms into a bracelet with this turtle. Turtle, they live for a long time. It's another symbol of eternity. So, and that wonder really shows up that rings could be worn in different ways. On the right-hand side, we have the between the finger rings, the lotus rings. So this is really landmark for creation. You cannot see where it transforms, and you can wear it between the fingers on different fingers. According to your mood, you can close it or open it. So this is another interesting aspect on ring. Then if we continue into the discussion into art and craftsmanship and achievement, we actually go into artist rings. So here we have very two interesting three-dimensional sculptures, Laure.
Absolutely. So we were talking about Jean Vendôme and David Ansel before, who were trained as artists as well. Here we're looking at artists that are practicing as artists, as sculptors, and painter in the case of Damien Hirst, and they actually translated their art into jewelry. So they're first and foremost visual artists. Like when we're looking at Sophia Vary, it's actually a piece that is inspired by her monumental sculptures. So she is a sculptor first and foremost. She does monumental pieces with very luxurious material for sculpture, such as actually bronze or marble. And as she had to travel a lot, she is the spouse of Fernando Botero, so a very famous artist, Colombian, and they traveled the world a lot. She also traveled for her whole career. And as she was traveling so much, she couldn't carry all the sculptural material with her, so she started doing miniature sculptures. And from that originated the beautiful jewelry collection and the Calliope ring, notably, Calliope being the muse of poetry. So you can see all the important Renaissance inspiration here and the mythological inspiration and the beautiful materials she's using here, which really are a translation of the material she uses in sculpture. When we're looking at the Damien Hirst piece, it's a very different realm because we're looking at a piece that is inspired by several of his artworks. So Damien Hirst is a British artist, and he's very famous, of course, for a variety of creations. Mostly what we know of him is some type of cabinets, and for instance, he did medicine cabinets. He was really interested in the relationship between science and religion as well. So here we're looking at a collection that is the cathedral collection, and it's the peel ring. So he was fascinated also through different type of, through the pharmaceutical painting that depicted different type of controlled substances. Through the medicine cabinets, through different accumulation, he was looking at the presence and the actually the impact of medicine in our society. Again, this relationship between science and religion, what do you believe in? And it's almost a belief today to use all these medicine, especially when we're talking about the medicine that he's depicting here, which is like, for instance, Valium or Prozac. These are substances that are supposed to help your mood and your psyche. So it's fascinating to see that an artist such as Damien Hirst, that is really used to making monumental works. I'm sure you may have in mind like the giant stained glass he did, again, relationship with religion and cathedrals, and this looking at how he miniaturized that into this collection of jewelry here. So it's really interesting to see that very famous contemporary artists are also creating jewelry.
Yeah, so and what we want to point out here is actually also that we see this kind of connection. We've been discussing on amulets, protection. Here you have your medicine on your finger to protect you, heal you from any kind of down mood you might have. So it's an interesting connection as well. And now, in a way to encapsulate all the creativity we can see with rings, we actually go to Asia and we look into Wallace Chan and Cindy Chow. So Wallace Chan is an artist born in Hong Kong, and he's been working for more than 40 years now. And he was trained from a very early on age as a jeweler and basically a very important goldsmith. And he started at the age of 15-ish. And what you can see here is first color combinations, very strong colors that would be used in the gemstone selection, but also the use of titanium. And actually, Wallace Chan nowadays is really seen as the forefather figure of new metal and especially titanium engraving kind of techniques. So he even patented some of the methods related to titanium use in jewelry. So he's now collected by many museums around the world, and this is so interesting to see that artists and jewelers are part of museums while they are still alive. So this is an interesting connection. Is it art? Is it fashion? Is it sculpture? Is it jewelry? This is the whole kind of border and boundary we are questioning now. On the right-hand side, we have Cindy Chow. She's a Taiwanese artist. Her family is into the, let's say, architectural and, let's say, artistic background. And here we see the very hoop of the ring she created. We see this kind of serpentine kind of shape that looks like the kind of infinity knot or the kind of no ending and no beginning kind of cycle, paired with diamonds and a very big pink gemstone. So we have the colors again for love, we've been discussing, but on a complete different design. And she's actually also collected from in many museums, among with the Smithsonian Institute in actually Washington, D.C. So you see how those creators and jewelers are now part of. Is it the decorative arts? Is it the visual arts? This is an interesting question. We don't have the answer of, but this is an evolution we can see in the world in general. So with those two interesting figures, we actually are leaning towards our conclusion with Laure. Let's find one thing to wrap it up. How do we conclude, my dear? What do we want you to take home?
So when we're looking at jewelry, and especially rings, of course we say that it's something to be worn by the wearer, to be seen by the wearer, and to be seen by the outside world. So what we're looking at here are actually a very iconic pair, not a pair as they're not supposed to be worn together, but when we're looking at these two pieces, we know exactly who the owner is, we know exactly the heraldry of the family, it's all related. So we're looking at the hands of Diana and Charles, and this is the British royal family. Of course, it's the hands together. One of the two rings is really showing the royal family heraldry, and the other one is the ring that Diana was wearing. These were inherited by actually the son of the royal couple, and it's now part of Kate and William
DNA kind of, right?
Absolutely. So when you're looking at these pieces, you know not only what family they're related to, you know not only what level of social hierarchy somehow you're looking at, but you also know exactly who they belong to. So it's really fascinating. On the other side, we're looking at a more fashionable piece in the sense of it's more like
a brand, right?
Exactly.
It's a branding
it is a brand,
tool.
Absolutely. So it's a branding tool. And again, it goes back to the brass knuckles that you were discussing earlier. And it's also branded with Machino on it. So you see something that says, of course, it's a social status in a very different way, but it's not identified necessarily with the person who owns it, it's identified with the brand. So no matter what you're looking at, you also have something that is related. You have a lot of information that comes with the ring. And that's the whole point, really.
So here, rings to go home with, they were usually home and let's say men devices, and now into our houses, it's more female wearer related, but they are fascinating tiny objects that say much more than what we think of. So you might not look at your hands the same way now. You have all those little informations. So now we are actually at the end of this conversation, and we are actually just like let's say briefing you We in Hong Kong have a nice exhibition on men's rings on display. So at the moment, men's jewelry is coming back in a way, and it's going back into the masculine kind of identity more and more. And in Hong Kong, we have this men's rings exhibition, which is a tribute to the late Yves Gastou, French gentleman who collected men's rings only. We have 300 of them here in Hong Kong. We already exhibited them in Paris and Tokyo. And well, maybe they could travel for more adventures. So we even have a nice catalog devoted to men's rings written by our colleagues. There are a lot of talking about rings, there are a lot actually of specialized books that if you want to know more about, we can discuss. But I think now we are getting towards the Q&A sessions, right? So for that, I need my phone where all the questions have been listed. So let me see. I'm looking into what Alice sent me for... So I'm going to introduce the books. I can see you want to do your homework very quick, dear. So wonderful. Well, books, it's just part of them. But if you, well, let's say that, especially if you are in America at the moment, Smithsonian, Metropolitan, they have amazing like kind of catalogs and literature jewelry related. Victoria and Albert Museum, British Museum, Louvre Museum, Akone Museum in Japan, they also provide interesting jewelry collections. But here we have this book, which is amazing. It's by the lady Diana Scarisbrick. She's kind of a diva for, but in a good way, for rings and jewels. She's really so important that I selected actually 2 books written by Diana. So those are really interesting books, really listing up the very many changes and different categories of rings. And you will see we didn't mention all of them. Then the other book I have is actually that book, which is, oh, sorry, I'm pressing on my mic. Thank you, my dear. This is a very nice Ring Through the Ages. So this is a bit more, in a way, encyclopedic, and you have a picture and description. I really love that book. And it also mentions the hand ornamentation and conservation of hands in mummies, Egyptian or Chinese kind of funeral practices. So because if you travel as an ancient ruler, if you travel to the afterlife, you want your hands and all your fingers to travel in the afterlife with you. So another interesting connection, but so many interesting things to say. Actually, Times and Hudson for the V&A also published a very tiny book. It's a book. It's a yellow book. Sorry, it's beautiful and it's called Rings. So it's a shorter one and it's more for modern kind of, or let's say, from Renaissance until nowadays. But there are a lot of things about rings, and I'm sure there are many other catalogs we did not know of. But please share with us if you know a very good book. We always buy books at l'école. We are always. Actually basically completing our library, so please feel free to share with us. And then the other book is the catalog from the men's ring collection from Hong Kong. Then the question, would the Chinese archers' rings also be used for wax seals?
Not that I know of. The seals are really not, they're portable devices, but they're usually independent devices. So to my knowledge, and again, like being an archaeologist, we have to be humble and know that we keep knowing more as we advance in time and discover more things, sites or grave of tombs. But in the case of the archer ring we looked at, they were really supposed to be of practical use. So they were really just for anti-army warfare. They were not necessarily like symbols of individual identity and for seals, to my knowledge. However, as Mathilde mentioned, afterlife, some of them were indeed placed in the tombs with their owner to travel with them in the afterlife, especially jade pieces.
Second question, how were the internal engravings made on the rings? Looks like black ink for some of them. No, this is not ink, this is enamel. Enameling is a vitrification process. Basically, glass is made out of silica and different oxides to make it colorful. And then that kind of glass material would be fused on metal to create enamel. We have conversations on enamel, and it's kind of a very worth to study topic that we cannot describe. If it's engraving on the hoop or on the bezel of the ring, of course, then it's an engraver. It would be a goldsmith engraving gold. And then if it's enamel, part of the goldsmith's workshop might have an enameler specialized into this vitrification process. Another question, can you share the process to make some of the rings? Well, that would be a very good question for a jeweler. So yes, you ask if they are using lost wax techniques. It could be, it depends. For instance, Laure showed us the golden dragon Chinese ring. That would not be lost wax, that would be casted because it's so much solid gold. But we can debate on the different techniques. It really depends, it's case by case. It's really like according to the object. But again, we think making a ring is easy. It is not at all, especially for the balance. And if it's like with different hoops, it's even more challenging. So, and that is why when you want to size one of your rings, one day you inherit a ring, you go to a shop and say, oh, can I resize it? Sometimes to modify the metal, you have to insert and to take away, unset actually the gem or the material that is on the bezel. Otherwise, everything would crack. So it's not that easy to size rings. What about the Chinese ring with 3 lotus birds? The 3 was referenced as being related to the Trinity. Trinity in Chinese sculpture basically means from 2 becomes another human.
It was not a Christian reference.
But the number 3 exists anyway.
It's more like, I should have said trilogy to be quite exact. Not trilogy, but like it's more like number 3 being like mother, father, and child. Mm-hmm. It's not related to Christianity at all. No. Yeah.
So yes, the number 3 is quite auspicious.
But number 3 is very important, yeah.
I'm afraid we, you just want, can you please repeat the name of the museum in Japan that you referenced? It's the Hakone Museum. It's a collection devoted to a lot of Western jewelry.
Yes.
Hakone, if I remember well. Well, I think we are leaning towards the end of the Q&A session, but thank you for your great, I know it's kind of getting late now in your part of the world, if you are from the US or from America, but thank you, it's been a pleasure to be with you. Before we leave you, please pin down next online conversation, you can see it here. It's again, we go back to ancient China, right?
Absolutely. So it's about gold and treasure from ancient China. This is in the context of the exhibition that will be taking place in Paris, which is a sequel, a different version of the exhibition we had in Hong Kong about ancient Chinese gold. And that will be with Olivier Segura and Valentina Brucoleri. So we invite you to actually attend it and listen to it. And actually, if you want to know more about the different techniques of working gold, of goldsmithing, we have a lot of videos available about these different techniques online in the context of the exhibition that was in Hong Kong that focused on the goldsmithing.
Yes, so go back on the L'École online library. You might have a lot of videos to look at. Well, I think this is the end to it. So thank you very much. And well, I think I would say good night for many of you. Bye-bye.
Bye.